Kלים Perek Tesvav, Mishnah Aleph. We're now starting literally a new chapter in the Mesechta. We've done with Kli Cheres, we've done Kli Matches, and now we're going to start Kli Eitz. And Kli Eitz eventually just merges into Begodim, and this takes us all the way to the end of the Mesechta, apart from Perek Lamed, which deals with glass. So let's just recap. We've done Kli Cheres. Kli Cheres, the rules of Kli Cheres you can find in Parshas Chukas, in the Parshas Paraduma. Matches, you can find that the rules of Matches are mentioned in Parshas Matos with the Mechemes Midyon. The group of eights, as the Mishnah says, Kli Eitz, Kli Or, Kli Etzem, which is wood, leather, and bone. This group is mentioned in Parshas Shmini. The group actually, the Torah says, Mikol Kli Eitz Oy Beged Oy Sok, so there's Beged as well. Beged has a lot of similarities to Eitz, but is actually dealt with later on in the Masechta, from Perek Chofvav onwards. Mitzvah Shem will do that then. The Zechuchis mentioned in this group is actually Midrabanon. Midaraisa, glass is not Mekabel Tumah, and glass is going to be dealt with later on in Mitzvah Shem in the 30th Perek Lamed. So let's look at this group. Eitz, Oir, and Etzem. Wood, leather, and bone. The basic rule is, says the Mishnah, and the same rule applies to glass, although it's midrabanon. Peshutei and Tyrin. We're talking about something which is a kli. If it's a kli poshut, that means it doesn't have a base kibble, it's tyr. Umekablehen tamein. But if it has a base kibble, then it's tamei. Then they are tamei. What is important to know is whenever we're talking about a kli eitz with a base kibble, it's not just good enough that it has a shape, it has a base kibble. It also must be osuli kibble. The purpose of the person who made the kli is the purpose of this indentation, what the Rambam calls a sheka, is not only that it has a kibble, it is able to be mekabel, it was actually made in order to put something in it. Then it's called a mekabel and it's tamei. Nishbaru, the normal rules apply when something breaks. It's taru. And there are special rules to determine what's called breaking of a kli, which we'll deal with later on in Mitzvah Shem. Chazav also and kelim, after it's broken and it's become tahor, you now then go and remake it. You have a broken chair, and you take the pieces and you remake it into a keli. It's mekabel in tumah mikan ulahaba. This is in contrast from Kli Matches, which we dealt with at the beginning of the 11th Perek, with Rabbanon or Gozer. In the case of Kli Matches, when you break it or melt it, and then you re-melt it and remake it, it's Chozer to Mos HaYeshana, which is the Tumah Rabbanon. This rule does not apply to Kli Eitz. The normal rule applies. It's broken, it's broken. If you remake it, it is able to be Mekabel Tumah Mikan Ulahaba. Eitz. We start off again with the word eitz. What does eitz actually translate to? We say wood. This is Machlokes Rishonim. The Rambam holds that the word eitz actually includes anything which you make from what in English is called plant life. In other words, you make it from trees, bushes, reeds, cane, even grasses. Any sort of plant. As long, of course, as the kli itself is got a certain degree of sturdiness to allow it to be called a kli. If it's just so shaky and flimsy, then it falls down under that rule. But as long as it's firm and sturdy, then it doesn't have to be a tree. There are other Rishonim, there's a machlokes about this point, but this is the Shittas of Rambam, and that's the one we're going to take on for the rest of this Masechta. So that's the basic rule of Kli Eitz. Now, Oir and Etzem has the same rule. It's completely the same rule as Oir. Keli made out of bone or Mekabel Tumah, as long as they have a Kli Kibble. Oir, also leather. However, leather is going to be dealt with later on, because leather has an added complication that it's also soft. And therefore leather, we'll see that even when it's flat, because you can wrap it and roll it and turn it into a pouch, can be Mekabel Tumah even though it's not actually a Kli Kibble now. And also we'll deal with leather later on, because leather is also going to bring us in to the Tumah of what's called Tumas Medras, which can apply to 8, but normally applies to Oir and Beged, and therefore will be dealt with, and Medrash rules we'll deal with later on in Mitzvah Shem and the Masechta. Now we're going to move on to another basic important din. This is the rule known as Kli Eitz Haba B'Midah. We learn that from the Pasuk, this Pasuk in Shmini, when it says the word Eitz, Oy Beged, Oy Sok. These 4 items, Sok is, as we know, it's the same English word as a sack. It's a form of beged made out of the fibres from the wool, you could call it, of a goat. Much rougher, much coarser than a regular beged. It's called a sock. But we learn that from this word sock, that a sock is a sack. And a sack is something which you put things in, throw over your shoulder, and you can walk around with it and carry things with it. We learn out from there that for a Kli Eitz to be Makabel Tumah, anyone of this group, Eitz, Oir, Beged, or Sock, not only must it have a Kli Kibble, it also must be able to be carried, it must be portable, both when it's empty and when it's full. Just like a sack, you can carry an empty sack and you can carry a full sack. It's made to be carried when it's full. Huadin, 8. Any keli of 8 or an etzer must be what's called mitaltel mole v'rekon. However, if it's so big, or when it's full, it is not carried, it's too heavy or just too unwieldy, then it's called a kli etzer osul nachas. It's not a kli made for carrying. True, you can carry it when it's empty, but you don't move it when it's full. And then it is out of the group, it's exempt, it's not able to be Makabel Tumah. That's the basic exemption, Kli Haba B'Midah. We'll come to that many, many times in this Masechta of Mitzvah and the next Masechta of Oholis. Now, before we continue the Mishnah, let me just give another little hakdama to Kli Eitz Osel Nachas, which is going to explain the Shittas HaRambam, as explained by the Chazon Ish. And that's going to help us understand the rest of the Mishnah. Kli Eitz Osel Nachas. The Rambam holds that if you want to determine whether a Kli is Osel Nachas or not, you've got to look at that actual Kli. The size, the actual size doesn't matter. You can have a Keli which is less. We're going to come to a shear of 40 sa'ah, which is big, 3 cubic amas. That shear is not as important as we think. If a Keli is definitely always moved, it is portable, even if it's massive. Remember, these rules only apply to wood, they don't apply to metal. A metal Kli is always Makabel Tumah. But if a Kli is bigger than a 40 sa'ah and is still Mitaltel Mole V'Rekon, then the Metzias, the fact that it is moved, overrides the Mem Sa'ah rule, and therefore it's Makabel Tumah. If a Kli is less than 40 sa'ah, but is not moved when it's full, then it is called a Kli Eitz Osel Nachas and is not Makabel Tumah because it is now not a Mitaltel Mole V'Rekon, despite the fact it's less than 40 sa'ah. We're going to have a list of Kelim to which the rule of the 40 sa'ah applies. Because these are Kelim which we don't necessarily know whether they are portable or not. So when it's called a case of stam, when we have a Kelim where we don't know whether it's portable or not, then a Chazal came in and they said, look at the shear. If it's got a shear of 40 sa'ah, if it can carry more than 40 sa'ah, it's more than 3 cubic amas, then the assumption is that it is not moved when it's full and therefore is tired, and if it hasn't got 40 sa'ah, the assumption is that it is moved. Now we can carry on with the Mishnah. And this is going to be a list of Kelim where we don't necessarily know whether these Kelim are moved. But Chazal said, to these Kelim, you have to apply the rule of 40 sa'ah. They are Shidor, Teva, and Migdal, which is the classic trio. These are types of chests and big crates. And a Migdal is a cupboard. Kaveres Hakash, Kaveres Hakon, and these are beehives, enormous things made out of straw. Kaveres is a beehive, are made out of konim, out of reed. Uboir Sphino Alexandris. Sphino Alexandris is the name for a big ship. Boats that went on the boat to Alexandria. And because you can't drink seawater, they had on board an enormous urn, container, made out of wood, to store drinking water. These type of kelim, says the Mishnah, if sheyesh lem shalayim, if they can sit, they have a base, they have a flat base. Vein machzikin arboim sa'ah belach. They are big enough to hold 40 sa'ah of liquid. In other words, that's 3 cubic amas, the size of a mikveh. Shehem koirayim biyovish. Of course, when you put liquid into a box, it can only go up to the level of the walls. If you were to put yovish, which is dry grain, you can pile it much higher. And the Gemara assumes that on a normal size kalim, you can always pile another 50%. So if you can put 40 sa'ah of lach, you can have 60 sa'ah of yovish, which is 60 sa'ah is 2 koir, because a koir is 30 sa'ah. If these kalim, the shidduch, teva, migdal, the kaveres, and the boir, have a shear of 40 sa'ah, then the assumption is, says the Tanna Kama, harei einu toirin, because they cannot be moved. If they have less than 40 sa'ah, the assumption is they can be moved, they are metaltum oliv rekan, and they're makabel tuma. Ushar kol kalim, any other stam kalim where you don't know, then it doesn't make it. You don't apply the 40 sa'ah. The rule is bein mekabelin, bein eino mekabelin. Tanna Kama's machmeh, it says, only to these kalim do you apply, the ones mentioned, do you apply the rule of 40 sa'ah. All other kalim, whether they have 40 sa'ah or not 40 sa'ah, they are assumed to be able to be portable. Unless you know for sure it's not, then it doesn't make a difference what the size is. But all other kalim, if you don't know, the assumption is you can move them, and therefore the temein divei Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is actually quite machem, and he says the rule of 40 sa'ah applies only to those kalim that are mentioned. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Instead of giving you a list A, which are tohar, and saying all other kalim are tamei, I'm going to give you a list B, which is actually going to specify those kalim which are tamei, whether they carry 40 sa'ah or not, because they're always portable, and then you can assume that any other kalim which is not in my list B is automatically tor if it carries 40 sa'ah. And his list of those kalim which are definitely tamei, even though they do carry 40 sa'ah, are as follows. Dardur agala, this was a big barrel they used to put on the wagon to carry their drinks or their beer or their wine. Kustas HaMalachim, when the royalty aristocracy used to travel on their fancy wagons, they had these cupboards with lots of compartments where they used to schlep all their food and drink and bits and pieces. Arevas who I've done in tanners, people who work leather, had an enormous trough in which to work the leather. Uboyer Sfina Katana, the water tank of a smaller ship, of a small boat. Ha'oroin is a transportable and movable chest. These are always carried, they're always moved. Therefore, Alpha Pisha Mekabelin, even though they have a share of 40 sa'ah, they are tamei. Because the whole point of these is to be moved when they've got things inside them. All other kalim which are not mentioned in list B, then you apply the rule of 40 sa'ah. Hamakablin, those which have 40 sa'ah, Toirin are assumed not to be portable. She'enon mekablin, Tamein, and those which don't have 40 sa'ah, are portable and tamei. So Rabbi Yehuda has a list of those that are tamei, and he says everything else is tor. Rabbi Meir has a list of everything that's tor, and everything else is tamei. Says the Mishnah, despite the fact you've got two lists and two extremes, what's fallen in the middle, what's fallen between two stools, is only one item. Ein ben divei Rabbi Meir divei Rabbi Yehuda el arevas bal habayis, a home domestic trough used for carrying things around the house into the garden. Then that falls between two stools. According to Rabbi Meir, who listed the kalim which are tahirim, the areva falls to be considered a tamei because it's not that moved. It's only moved occasionally. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who lists the kalim which are tamei, he says an areva is not in that list. And therefore an areva is assumed to be in the original list, and therefore is determined purely on the 40 sa'ah, not 40 sa'ahs before. Before I finish this Mishnah, I very much want to read out a few words in the Chazon Ish. It's a beautiful, beautiful prose, how he explains what the use is to us when we see lists like this. We have the general rule, as I explained before. Then we have a list of various objects. I'll just read it through straight in Hebrew. Says the Chazon Ish, Uplukta zu eino elo bachroas shikul das Torah. Kfi ma shero v'yodu tiv hakelim hahem v'tashmishon. Vein onu yechoilin lilmoid mehen ledugmosa. We can't actually use this list to apply to other kelim. Vein machlukoson, the machlok is irrelevant elo l'shaton u'ledoiron lanhogas hamase. Ki hadimyon shel hamasim. Lema sheba b'Torah aleim. This ability to be able to compare this list to other kelim, tzricha lachachachmas hachachomim shebechol doir v'doir lachoros laom es hamasa sheyasun. V'nifeles b'hem machloikas ketava dvorim sichem. Of course, when you're dealing with aspects and concepts, you're going to have machloikas. V'talmideim shel Ramei of Rabbi Huda sheyodu has a kelim eile. They knew the particular kelim. The pluktas Rabbi Seinu b'hem. They knew exactly what the Rebbe's meant. Yodu, they were able to know gam lodun mehem. Aval onu, says the Chazon Ish, ein lanu lilmud mishmois hakelim shum din. We just all we can do is apply the general rule, but we can't actually use the names of these kelim for any din. Va'tokas haposkim shemos ha'elech hayotze binyonim edu. Reason why the poskim bring these items. Hula te'eles hagas hayidia habaruro b'mishnah u'v'gemara she tachlis yidias ha'torah. V'zo kavanas haposkim b'sifreim b'mkoymes harbei. V'lei chodlu lasos signoinam u'leshoinam v'ma sheyete'eles l'talmidim b'havanas hasugya al mochoina. Af sheyachbid hasignoin hazeh v'loshen hahi. Although this such items actually make things harder to understand. Alaloi midavreim hanogas hamasa b'li hovin b'gemara. Nevertheless, we have the words which the Tanoim used to, and these are the words the Tanoim used so that they understood what to do. But we, as the Chazon Ish, are not able to use these particular kelim and work out halacha l'maaseh. We have to apply the general rule and look in the Tosefta and the Rishonim as they explain it to us. That was a long Mishnah, but a very, very important one.